With the help of Hashem, we are learning Pesachim Daf Ayin Gimel. We are going to be learning the last daf of the 6th chapter of Elu Dvarim. We are going to first continue on Daf Ayin Beis Amud Beis to look for a source for the statement, for the din that Rabbi Yechanan taught. Rabbi Yechanan said that if Yevimtoi Nidoi Nida Baal, that if a man who's doing the mitzvah of Yibum does it inadvertently, exactly when the Yevama was a Nida, so normally any relation, any sin, b'mezid, kadis, b'shoigeg brings a chatos, but because of the rule that we're learning that ta'ah b'dvar mitzvah exempts you from a chatos, so Rabbi Yechanan paskin that you're pater. Now the novelty of that rule of Rabbi Yechanan is that unlike the other cases that we have been learning and the cases that the Gemara was suggesting at the end of Daf Ayin Beis Amud Beis, where there is a zmanoi bohul, there's a certain pressure and hurry that comes about a person because they're doing a mitzvah that's time limited, which again justifies for them not doing the research which would have given them the information that what they're doing is prohibited. A man, there's a mitzvah to do yibum, but it doesn't have to be right now. It can be tomorrow. It can be next week. Yet Rabbi Yechanan applied the rule of tabed var mitzvah pater from chatos. So we're looking from exactly which Tanoic statement that Rabbi Yechanan learned that even again when there's no zman bohu, you're going to be waived from the chatos. And that's really, we're going to go from there. We're going to have a chazara on Daf Ayin Gimel of the many unique halachas that we have in kachim. Like, for example, that if a carbon is offered in certain circumstances, even when the carbon is discovered or when it becomes invalidated, puzzle, if the fats that normally would have been burnt on the mizbeach were brought up on the altar, im alu. So there's an interesting din, lo yerdu. Now we learned exceptions to that if the invalidation happened even prior from the animal's entry to the Beis Hamikdash, then we say im alu, yes yerdu. But we're going to apply that law to the dinim that we're learning. We're going to chazar over the halacha l'Moshe Misinai that there are 5 chatois, hamesois. Normally, when an animal that's imbued with kedushas aguf becomes puzzled when it's still alive, normally you wait for it to get blemished. It's called yiru ache yisto'avu. You can't right away redeem it because it has kedushas aguf. But once it becomes blemished and thus invalidated to go on the mizbeach, then normally you do have to then redeem it, and with its funds you buy the same animal type. Now there's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai that in 5 cases, by uniquely a chatos, that if the chatos becomes invalidated, I'm just giving you an example, the owner separated the chatos, but before he brought it, he lost it. So he takes another animal and he brings it for his sin. A chatos cannot be offered as a donation. It has to come for a specific sin. So the person is already redeemed, the person is already atoned for that sin. So by a chatos, you have to leave the animal to die, as we learned to pratim in kachim. So there's another rule, which goes according to almost all of the opinions, that kol shebachatos meisa, which is the 5 cases. If you remember, there's a remes to the 5 cases with the word v'timna hoise pelegish. V'timna roshi tevos is vav taf mem nun ayin, goes to the 5 cases. So by an asham is similar to a chatas. An asham also only comes for a specific sin, but by asham roya, there you do allow the animal to graze, and when it becomes blemished, you use its funds to buy a kates hamizbeach oilas nedava oilas tzibur. We'll speak it out with more details when we learn the Gemara. So the case that we'll be learning is that what happened if you had such an asham and you already consigned it for grazing, but instead of you allowing it to taka go and graze and wait until it gets blemished and you're redeeming it, once you consigned it, you accidentally brought that animal itself as an oila. So we're going to learn that if that's b'diavad, you did a good avodah. The carbon functioned as a kates hamizbeach, as an oila. We're going to learn if that's the case, why do you even have to consign it to go grazing? Why didn't you take the animal itself and bring it as an oila? So we're going to learn about that on Daf Ayin Gimel. And for almost the entirety of Ayin Gimel Amid Beis, the Gemara is going to first quote Rav Huna's version of what Rav says. And what Rav says is that a carbon's designation changes automatically, which is a topic that we're learning a lot about. So, for example, a Pesach shaloi b'zmanoi, do you have to do an uprooting of into a shlamim, and if not, it remains a Pesach, or does it automatically Does the carbon's status automatically change? We're going to give examples for that. So Rav Huna says that Rav says that yes, a carbon's designation automatically changes. And then we're going to quote a brisa that appears to contradict Rav, and that will be the whole Ein Gimel Amud Beis, or almost the whole Ein Gimel Amud Beis, and we're going to work out how the brisa does not indeed contradict Rav, and Rav Huna's version of Rav at the end will be correct, that yes, that Rav says, Rav holds that a carbon's designation changes automatically. Just before we begin learning, Rav Ashi and Avina, the Ruach HaKodesh, saw that there'll be many Yidden that they're going to be learning every day on a Seder, and then when it came to Kachim, certain people said, I can't take Kachim, and they drop out, and then they come back here by Moyed. So they thought that they got away with learning Kachim. So that's why Rav Ashi and Avina, Kedei Lazakas Es Yisrael, they bring a daf of Kachim here to Moyed. For those of us who missed then the opportunity, Chevra now is the ultimate tshuva. Chevra, we're going right back into Kachim. So here we go, daf Ayin Beis Amud Beis. We left off 10 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Yes, we're learning the sugya of Tabed Var Mitzvah. Yeah, we know that Tabed Var Mitzvah is Taka Pater Menachatos, but again, the unique din of Rabbi Yechanan, that Yevimtoi Nidoi Baal, where there's no Zmanoi Bohul, we're looking for a source where Rabbi Yechanan would have gotten from a Tana that you're also Pater. And like I said when we began this yesterday, we're not going to find a source, which doesn't really matter. We're not contradicting his halacha, but we're just wondering, where did Rabbi Yechanan get that from? Good. So Chavra count 10 lines from the bottom of the Amid. In middle of the line, the Ella ke Rabbi Yeshua, as his shita is recorded regarding a halacha in Truma, in Mesechtes Trumos. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shar kol yom. The Ella ke Rabbi Yeshua, the Truma, the Tran. Hoya oichel betruma, for Kohen is eating Truma. The Noida, and it becomes known to him that Oy Gewalt, he's a Ben Gerusha, Ben Chalutza. Ben Gerusha will make him biblically into a Chalal. Ben Chalutza, he'll rabbinically is a Chalal. In either case, some people say that if it's only a rabbinic Chalal, really this halacha won't apply. But the Tanoim, when they mention Ben Gerusha, they mention Ben Chalutza. That's not negaya for over here. So if he discovers that he really was not qualified to eat Truma, and the rule is that if I eat Truma b'shoigeg, so I have to give back the value of the Truma to the Kohen whom the Truma belonged to, and I have to add a fifth. Now, he ate it thinking he's a Kohen, but now he discovered he's not. So Rabbi Eliezer says, Mechayiv Keren v'Chaimish. Rabbi Yeshua, based on the rule that Tabed Var Mitzvah Patur, he doesn't have to pay anything back. Guys, not only is he not penalized with the fifth, when he ate it, they thought he was a Kohen. Tabed Var Mitzvah Patur. It's amazing. Now, here, there's no Zman Bohu. This L'chora should be a great proof that even if you don't have this time factor, he could have found out, but he didn't. He thought he was a Kohen. And he thought he was doing a mitzvah, Tabed Var Mitzvah Patur. L'chora, that's a great source. Says the Gemara, no, this also is not a source, because Dilma and Rabbi, that we're speaking this Mishnah is speaking only betruma of Pesach. Remember the whole beginning and the end of Perek Rishon? Truma has to be burnt. We don't want to burn Truma, especially if it's not Tameh. But if it's Chametz, you hashish kambreda. So here it's Erev Pesach. Before the Zman Isur, the ideal is not to burn the Chametz, that's Truma, but to consume it. So there was pressure for him to eat it. So there was a Zman Bohu. So here again, this is not a source for Rabbi Yechanan's application, of Tabed Var Mitzvah, even in a scenario where there's no Zman Bohu, which was in his case of Yevimtoi, Nida, Baal, Pater. Inami, furthermore, even if we're not going to accept Rav Bibi Barabai's limitation of the Mishnah, Shani Truma, the Ikra Avoida. Truma is considered an Avoida. Bachlal eating, like we said, Api Chasidus, the Kohanim's eating of Kachim achieves Api Pnimya Sonyanim a greater elevation. Yechudim, beyond Achilas Mizbeach. Tzadikim give Shanayim because of that. People think just because you're eating and the person happens to be consuming the food, it makes it lesser of a mitzvah. No, we don't look at it that way. That Kohanim eating Truma is tantamount to a Kohen doing the Avodah. And by Avodah, there's a unique rule. Va'avodah Rachmana Achshar. There's a unique rule that if an Avodah was done by a Cholol, as long as he did not know he was a Cholol, it means it was done b'shoigeg, his Avodah after the fact is validated. So that's a whole different thing. This is way beyond Tov B'Dvar Mitzvah. You're not going to be penalized. Actually, his eating achieved what the eating has to happen. What the Kohanim's eating of Truma has to achieve. He was a chalol. That's the rule. That avoida rachmana achshav. Where do we have that? Ditnan. Now this Mishnah is not telling you a din of eating Truma. It's telling you a din of pashat avoida. That hoya oimed umakriv. A kohen is mamish doing he's standing and doing the avoida in the Beis Hamikdash, and he did an avoida, and then he discovers that he's a ben gerusha ben chalutza. So how do we view all of the korbanos that he brought? Says the Mishnah, kol hakorbanos kulem sheikrev al gabam mizbeach psulin, and Rabbi Yeshua is machshir. Now, this is beyond Torah B'Dvar Mitzvah. Here, we're not speaking about the kohen being exempted from being penalized, right, for ruining the karbanis. No, the korban itself was kosher. And v'amrina, my time Rabbi Yeshua, and he quotes a pasuk in Parshas Zois HaBracha, the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu gave to the tribe of Levi, right, Ula Levi Amar. Towards the end, it says, Borech Hashem Cheloi, that Hashem blesses. The Cheloi here means the belongings of the Levi, which includes Kohanim. And then it adds, Ufayal Yodav Tirtze, and the deed of his handiwork God accepts. So what does that mean? That if a Levi or a Kohen doesn't have a handiwork, and then we discover he was a Chalal, Hashem accepts it. So that's a Mishnah for the Avodah. Now, how do we compare eating Truma to the Avodah? So the Gemara says, and the Truma, Heicha, Ikra Avodah. How do we know that it's the same? The Tanya, Maisa B'Rab Tarfon. That one time, one evening he didn't come to learn. Imagine. And did he get it? Shachris, in the morning, Motzoi Rabban Gamliel, who was the head, right, the Rabban, and Omar Loin, he tells Rab Tarfon, yesterday, last night, where were you? So Rab Tarfon answers, guys, don't forget Rab Tarfon lived after the Churban Abayis. So he tells him, Avodah Avadati. I wasn't last night in the Beis Midrash, I was doing Avodah. So Amaloi, so Rabbi Gamliel tells Rab Tarfon, Kol devarecha einon elo divrei tema. All of your words are a mystery. All of your words means he had two problems. First of all, even if the Beis Hamikdash would have been standing, Rabban Gamliel did not accept that Rab Tarfon's doing the avodah is more important than going to the Beis Midrash. And number two, there's no Beis Hamikdash. That's Kol devarecha. V'chi avodah b'zman hazeh minayin. So to which Rab Tarfon answered, Omar Loi, Harehu Oimet, Daf Ayin Gimel, Parshas Koirach, by Matnas Kohuna, Avoidas Matana Etein Es Kihunaschem. Now this includes all of the gifts that are given to a kohen. This includes Truma. And in the same verse, it says that the Hazor HaKorev, you must, that if a stranger, if a non-kohen, comes and does the Avodah, wow, Chayev Miso. So since the Torah puts together the Matnois Kohuna, and the Pashat working in the Beis Hamikdash, so Asu Achilas Truma, which is one of the Matnas Kohuna, Big Vul, and outside the temple, Ka'avodas Beis Hamikdash. So we conclude without finding a source of Rabbi Yechanan's din that we apply Tov B'Dvar Mitzvah. Potter, even in a scenario where you don't have this manoi, bo.
Rabbi, was there Achilas Truma with no Beis Hamikdash? I'm not understanding.
Okay, so very important, very good question. Yes, there is. Not only was there Achilas Truma, but even after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed for a while, we had means of becoming pure from Tumas Meis Tzvika, because we still had some of the ashes of the red heifer. Now, there are many nuances. First of all, that when the majority of the Yidden don't live in the Holy Land, the whole eating of Truma is only midrabanan. So let's assume that the Rov of the Yidden were not living in the Holy Land, which is probably what was happening. During the times of the Second Temple, most of the Jews were not living there. So eating Truma was midrabanan. Nevertheless, he calls this avodah. Nowadays, we also have to separate Truma. Let's make it clear. You live in Israel. Elamah, because of the din of Truma, everything is redeemed on money, and then the money is thrown into Yam HaMelech. That's because we don't have how to become pure. Let's go back. Okay, guys, we're going to analyze the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, Shachatul Shaloi La'achlav. And the Mishnah says that you're chayiv. Now I just want to add something very important. When we learned the Mishnah, I know I paused over here for a moment. Why doesn't Rabbi Yeshua say that you're potter? So we explained, because that's the whole Rabbi Yeshua, that you did an avodah, you made shchita, but you did not accomplish a mitzvah kolduhu. That was the very important notes. When no mitzvah at all is done, unlike Rabbi Meir, that is still lenient, no, Rabbi Shua says there has to be some mitzvah. And if you shechta Koren Pesach, Shaloi La'achlav, nothing was accomplished. So therefore, even Rabbi Yeshua will hold that you chayiv achatas. So says the Gemara, who even needed that? Don't forget that we learned these dinim on Samach Aleph. And Samach Aleph is where the Mishnah says, aside of the Shaloi L'Shmai and the L'Shmai, that's where the Mishnah introduced Shaloi L'Oichlav, Shaloi L'Menuyav, remember La'arelim, La'tmeim, and the Mishnah says it's Tamei. The Mishnah says if it's a dual intent, it's good. But Pshita, even the Hasam refers to Daf Samach Aleph, Pasul. So if it's completely invalidated, and we established even in our Mishnah in the Reisha, even Rabbi Yeshua, if Tobit van mitzvah, but no mitzvah was done, then you're chayiv. So of course you would have known it. So the Gemara says, you're right. The Shachtei Shalei La'achav is not teaching you anything novel. However, Shum, the Tana Sefer, that your putter, the Sefer is if the Kohen shechted it, both for those who are physically able to eat the kazayas, La'oichlav and Shalei La'oichlav, there the Koren Pesach is good, right? So therefore you're not going to bring a chatos, Tanareisha chayiv. The Gemara says that you didn't answer my question. That's also pshita. We also learned on Daf Samach Aleph that if you bring a Koren Pesach with a dual intent, not Lishmai Ushaloi Lishmai dual intent, but La'oichlav Ushaloi La'achlav, it's kosher. So if it's kosher, why would you be chayiv chatas? Abada Yapater. Right, good. Ela Vaited. El Aida the Tanash Chatoi Shaloi Lishmai Ayur chayiv. That's very important. And chayiv, even according to Rabbi Yeshua, because a Pesach that's slaughtered l'shem shlamim is completely invalidated. So just for the sake of symmetry, Tananami Shaloi La'oichlav. But the Gemara goes on that, V'higu Falamali. Don't we know that if you shachter Koren Pesach, Shaloi L'shmai, we know that from the Mishnah in Pesachim, we know that from Zajac, we know this from, I think it was Nun Tesamud Beis, in the beginning of the Sugya, that Shaloi L'shmai completely invalidates it. So again, why did the Mishnah have to say there that even Rabbi Yeshua says you're chayiv? That the Gemara says you're right. That was the intro. We wanted to bring the case where it was the opposite. It was a shlamim l'shem Pesach, and it was ru'uyin, and that is where you have the machlekes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. So to introduce that case, we brought already the case where it's a Pesach shaloi l'shmei chayiv. But if it was a shlamim l'shem Pesach and ru'uyin, there you have a machlekes. Okay, and says the Gemara, Amalei Rav Huna bar Chinan liberate. Do me a favor. That kiyoslis lekamei de Rabbi Zreika. Please ask of him. Guys, before Kachim, we're going backwards now. First we go to Shabbos. What did we learn on Shabbos Kufay? Couple of steps. Step number one, that for you to be in violation of Shabbos, your act has to be called Meleches Machsheves, which means many things. It means also it has to be done for a constructive purpose. Remember that? So if a person does a malacha and it's a completely destructive act, even if he broke one of the 39, step number one is midai raisa, he's not going to be chayiv. He's not chayiv chatas. Then we learned that there is a machlokes regarding whether there are exceptions. What might be the two exceptions? Wounding and burning. Shabbos Kufay, opinion number one holds that even if you wounded or if you burned something and it was purely destructive, you're still going to be chayiv. It's an exception to the rule of meleches machshavas. Opinion number two, and we're going to focus on opinion number two, that whenever you learn about someone wounding, which is a shchita, is wounding, or burning, you know when you're going to be chayiv chatos, if there was some constructive outcome from it, like the example the Gemara gave, a person wounded an animal because you wanted to take the blood to give it to the dog. Remember that whole little sugya about kishuv and v'chulei. So that's one exception. And in other words, the Gemara is asking now, let's go back to our case. Our case is you shechted an animal in a case where the animal is completely invalidated. You're chayiv chatos. So the question is, ledivrei ha'omer mekalkol b'chabura. If you do an act of kilkol b'chabura, we don't say that this is an exception. You are also only chayiv if there is some constructive purpose. And if not, if it's just an act of wounding, which is normally an act of kilkol, you're going to be exempt. And our Mishnah is saying that if you shecht an animal only shaloi la'achlav, right? Since, even according to Rabbi Yeshua, since there's no mitzvah called who you're chayiv, what exactly did you accomplish? Where is the some constructive purpose? Chayiv matikein. What did you improve? Great question. In other words, l'chura, this should prove that the chabura, that the wounding and burning is a mamash an exception. So Yomar is no. You know what you're a misakein im olo lo yerdu. What's again, means that even when an animal is completely invalidated, if the invalidation happened after the animal was in the Beis Hamikdash, and wrongfully, erroneously, or even God forbid, purposefully, someone brings that animal on the altar, there's something about it's on the altar, im alu lo yerdu. So if the animal was geshachted and it's not completely invalidated, but if it would be brought up, it would stay on the altar and be burnt there. So that's called it. There's some tikkun. That piece of animal has the merit. It's amazing, even through an act of olu, which should not have happened, that, it's going to be given to God. The Gemara says, hold on, that doesn't answer the question, because the Mishnah also gave an example, and as we learned over there, guys in Zvachim, that if the invalidation happened prior to it entering the Beis Hamikdash, even im olu yerdu, if the animal is a balmum, the invalidation or something that happened before it came into the holy temple. So again, and the Mishnah says you're chayiv. You don't say tabud var mitzvah because there's no mitzvah koldehu. But why are you chayiv? What's the problem with shchita? Shchita, by the way, I know we're saying shchita is chavala, and chavala is a tulda of shchita. I want you to know that by Shabbos we spoke about that. There's really a machlokes rishonim. Others say that the problem of wounding is because of dash. Anyways, let's just follow. It's going to work according to all of the shitas. Shchita, we're going to call it, that's an act of chayvel, and chayvel, we're going to go according that chayvel is part of wounding, that's shchita. So chayev matikein, answers the Gemara, I'll tell you matikein, that the case of the Mishnah will be that the blemish was that the animal had a cataract in its eye, that tikein bedoikin sheba'ayin, and really there's a machlokes tanoim, if this type of blemish, which is considered a minor blemish, that the goyim that also have rules regarding not offering a balmum to Hashem, they are allowed to offer an animal that has a doikin shaba'ayin. That's why the whole sugya in Gittin by Kamsa Bar Kamsa, what did he do? He made a cataract in the animal's eyes. So when the goyim found out that the Yidden did not want to bring it, they didn't think that it's because the animal was blemished, because according to their rules, a balmum can be brought. Now Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that if an animal has a mum of doikin shaba'ayin, even though it's a blemish that happened prior to the animal entering the Beis Hamikdash, but since by birds, remember, ein kamus v'zachrus bo'oifes, so we're more lenient by birds. Takef nitlo agapeha, then the animal is not good. That's called a big blemish, but smaller blemishes by birds are tolerated. If a bird has a cataract, even by Yidden, we can bring it as a carbon. So Rabbi Akiva also holds that Rashi reminds us that if an animal had a mum of doikin shaba'ayin, and if im olu after shchita lo yerdu, so we're just looking for some act of some constructive act, some alechas machshavas to justify why you chayiv, even though normally wounding or shechting is an inherent kilkul. The Amarim Allah still we're not good. For the final question, it says in the Mishnah later, in our Mishnah, that said, you found that the animal had a wound, you are exempt. Now it's very interesting. Why are you exempt? Just want to give you a heads up. So we learned that Rashi in the Mishnah, hold on, there's no mitzvah. There's no mitzvah kolduhu. Why are you pater from a chatas? So we learned in the Mishnah, you're called an anus. Right? It's an unavoidable transgression. So says Rashi. You should know that Tosfos Rabbi Akiva Eger points out that as we'll start learning the sugya, it will become clear from the Gemara here, it's not because of oinus. It's somehow connected to Shitas Rabbi Yeshua that holds Tov Dvar Mitzvah is potter. So if you found it to be a treifa, it's connected to Rabbi Yeshua, you're potter. But again, what does that imply? That if the tarfus, there's 18 samani treifus, some of them you cannot see, you can only discover after the shchita, the Masechta Schulin. But habegilu, you're chayiv. One of the blemishes, let's just say, is that the animal has one of its legs from a certain part cut off. You can see that. I matikein. So the answer is tikein lo hoitzi midei nevela. Every time you do an act of shchita, even if the animal may not be consumed because the animal is treif. And we spoke this out so much when we learned Masechta Schulin. See, now we're not practicing yet Tum Avatara. Now we shecht only to make the animal edible, halachically. But even when the act of shchita did not allow you to consume the animal because the animal turned out to be treifa, shchita always accomplishes something. This answers all the questions. And that is that if an animal dies naturally, or if a truck hits an animal, the animal gives off tumas nevela, with all of the restrictions, a kizayis basar, v'chulei. If an animal was slaughtered, even if the shechita did not accomplish anything to be matter, the meat to be consumed, but at least it took away the tuma from the remains. And that's called a tikkun. So therefore, don't tell me I'm a kalkel b'chabura is going to be pater, is a raya, that this is an exception. It's not an exception. Beautiful. Shechita automatically has some tikkun, some constructive purpose. Says the Gemara, maskiv l'ravina. Maskiv l'ravina, the Tanya, when we learned in a brayso that hashoichet, it means b'shoigik. Hashoichet chatos b'shabbos. And he does it outside the Beis Hamikdash. Now, a chatos, which is a private carbon, does not overrule Shabbos. Outside the Beis Hamikdash, no animal can be slaughtered. He did it l'shem avodah zarah, oy gewalt. So it says in a brayso, you chayv 3 chatois. Number 1 is you broke Shabbos, shechita. Number 2 is avodah zarah. Number 3 is shchutei chutz. So now the question is, matikein, what are you going to answer? You're going to answer, the act of shechita at least takes it away from it being tamei. Guys, we learned that anything connected to avodah zarah is tamei. So you didn't even remove it from tuma. So here, what are you going to answer? Wow. So there's an answer. Amar Abavira, shemoitzi midei ever menachai. Goyim are not allowed to have ever menachai. Goyim can eat nevela. Goyim are not bound by laws of tuma and tara. Any act of shechita, even if the carcass remains tamei, did something constructive. What did it do? Now a non-Jew can eat it. And before the animal was alive, when the animal is alive, it's Eiver Menachai. And of course, if the animal would have died by its own, it also would not have been Eiver Menachai. It doesn't matter. When you brought the animal from being alive, thus prohibited on all of the peoples in the world, and now you took the life, so now it's not Eiver Menachai, and that's considered a constructive act. Now Goyim can eat it. So any act of shechita, even where you don't remove tumah, it's still considered there is some constructive part to it. So it doesn't refute the second opinion that holds that wounding and burning is not an exception. Even there, you only chayiv if you have something constructive. You have to fly. Weiter. So the Mishnah wrote at the end that if they did shechita carbon Pesach, and then it was discovered that all of the owners removed their registration. Again, I know that Rashi in the Mishnah writes that you know why you're pater, because anus. Because it was it was a complete unavoidable transgression. But again, as we will see clearly, if it's an anus, even Elyahu will agree. Everyone is minded that the oinus rachmana patri. It's going to become clear. No, this is still somehow connected to Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Eliezer. It's only patir because there's a tabed var mitzvah aspect involved in it. Okay, so now we're starting. Amar Afuna Amarav. Asham shenitak l're'i. I know it's late, but guys, it's so geschmack the chazer these din. So a couple of steps. Step number 1 is we're not going to give all the examples, Pasha, there's no time. Like we mentioned in the intro, there's something unique about a carbon chatas. First of all, chatas can only be brought for a specific sin. I cannot go and bring a chatas and tell God, you know that I did so many sins b'shreigeg, let it cover my sins. Doesn't work that way. I have to know which sin I violated b'shreigeg, and I have to designate the animal for that sin. If for whatever reason I don't need any more atonement for it, just for example, one example is chatos sheneschapru be'oleha, because I designated animal aleph, and then I lost it, and I'm urging to get atonement. I'm in a rush, so I designate a new animal, and I bring it. So now I'm atoned. Then I found the lost animal. Chatos sheneschapru be'oleha. Normally the rule will be, well, that's kedushas haguf. You can't bring it. You can't bring it. Normally, you would wait until it gets blemished and you would sell it, and with its money, you would apply it for some kachim. By chatos, Hashem says to Moshe, that animal has to be left to die. We learned the dinim, you put it in a kippah. Right. There are 5 such cases. Again, the siman, the mnemonic was vitimna. So there is a machloikis. We are beginning with the opinion that holds that wherever Chazal said, kol shebechatos meisa, if you have a similar case by Asham also comes for specific sins, different sins. So if I have an Asham, if I was Chayv Asham, and I got my kapara already, and now I found my animal. So the rule by the Asham is that you have to uproot it from it being a chatos. How? Send it out for it to graze, and unsupervised, because when an animal is grazing unsupervised, it's likely that it's going to become blemished sooner rather than later. So it's called that you're menatik it, nitak, you uproot it. can't be brought as an asham. You don't have to let it die. You have to consign it. You have to designate it for it to go out to the pasture. Really, what should happen is wait until it gets blemished. Now you are allowed to sell it. So the animal that's sold now is completely chulin because it no longer had kedusha saguf. It got blemished. Now the kedusha went to the money. So the animal, whoever buys it, can do whatever he wants with it, with some limitations. You remember, you can't work with it. You can't share it because of the respect we give to kachim, but you can eat it. Now the money is used for what? So in the Beis Hamikdash they had the 13 pushkas, the 13 shofros. Many of them were pushkas in which you put money. We never wanted for the mizbeach to sit idle. So whenever there was nothing being brought as a chiyuv in the Beis Hamikdash, they would take money from these tzedakah pushkas and they would buy a carbon oila, which was brought on behalf of the whole community. These carbonis are called kates hamizbeach, the dessert of the altar. So the money should go for oila, communal oils. So what happens, says Rav, according to Rafuna, you have an asham. It was already consigned for it to go out to the pasture. But instead of you waiting for it to get blemished and then sell it, and then with the money buy an oila, you took this animal before it was blemished and you shechted it stam. That means you didn't have an intention for it to be an oila. You stam brought it, it's going to be kosher la'oila. Now, there's so many chidushim here, but we're going to focus on two. Number one, even though the rule is you have to wait for it to get blemished, and only with its value by an oila, what we're saying is that after the fact, after you consigned it, if you didn't consign it, then it's not good at all. But once you said, it's going to go out to the pasture, if you brought it, it's going to be good for an oila. But there's a bigger chiddush that Rav is saying, according to Rafuna, that not that you have to have specific intention when you bring it l'shem oila. You bring it stam. That means it was an asham. You never had a machshava that changed it. That means you never uprooted it. Rav holds that an animal gets automatically uprooted. Since the halacha says it cannot be brought as an asham, and its value will be going towards an oila, even if you did not intentionally uproot it, it's considered already an oila. And Alma, the focus will be kosover, that you don't have to have an active kavanah that uproots it. Loi boyi akira. What uproots it? The halacha. The fact that the Torah says you may not bring this as an asham, boom, it automatically is an oila. Now the question is, why can't you bring it right away as an oila? Why does it have to get blemished? We're going to get to it soon. But the focus will be that Rafuna is quoting Rav. Indeed, Rav subscribes to the loi boya akira. Asks the Gemara, well, if that's the case, the moment I already got my atonement, there's really 5 cases. I'm just giving one example. Asham shenas chapru be'olel, ki loy nitek nami. Even if you didn't even designate it for it to go out to the pasture, if you take the asham, we discovered the owner got atonement. What would happen if they brought it right now? Even here, Rav is saying it's not good. It needed to be nitak l'diya. Why? Now, if you have to uproot it, is one thing. But if you don't even have to actively uproot it, the halacha says that you can't be brought for an asham. It has to be used for an oila. So why do you have to even send it out to the pasture? So the Gemara says, biblically, yeah, you could. But there is a fear. An asham, if the owner is not atoned, may never be brought for another purpose. So if you're going to end up using this animal as is, why? Because the owner got atonement. Then one, there'll be a time that, God forbid, erroneously, there'll be the owner. The owner did not get atonement. And you're going to take the asham and you're going to bring it for an oila. That's never okay. So to make sure that you don't use an animal designated for an asham for something else, really we want it to get blemished. And you will want you to sell it. But the evid, as long as it at least went out to the pasture, it's going to remind people you can't make an asham into an oila. So that's enough of a boundary. Now, where do we find that Chazal made takanas because they were afraid this gezeira la'achar kapara ato lifnei kapara? That we find in Mishnah and Truma Ditran, that asham shemeisu ba'alav, that's one of the 5 cases, or the case that we are mentioning, oshen es chapru ba'alav. So what should really happen is a Mishnah. Yira achse yistot, should go to the pasture until it becomes disgusting. It means halachically disgusting, which means blemished. Whenever you hear the word yistoev, it should become a balmum, blemished, and then v'yamachid, you should sell it. Now, Rabbi Eliezer, he has this unique din, like Rashi reminds us, if you remember, we learned this in the beginning of Zvachim, it says in the pasuk, Kachatos ka'asham. When you hear the Torah, Kachatos ka'asham, according to Rabbi Eliezer, tells you that God told Moshe, Halacha Moshe Misinai, Chamisha, Chatois Mesois. Rabbi Eliezer applies the same rule to an asham. So he doesn't subscribe to any of this Yiracha Yistorif. That's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, that no. First, it should get blemished. You have to add those words in. That's very important. And after it becomes blemished, Yimacher, and the Yavi B'dam Avoila, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amud. So now the Gemara is asking Anav. Let's go back to Rabbi Yeshua, to the Mishnah, to the Tanach. The Damavin. You have to redeem it. Abel Gufay, but you can't use it itself. Why can't, if the animals, if its value is going to be used for an oila, bring this animal, it must be the Gazalacha Kapara Atolifne Kapara. So Rav now has 2 chidushim. Number one, you're supposed to exchange it, but as long as you at least put it out or designated the animal to go out to the pasture, then there's no more gezeda. And the ikar that we're focusing on is something else. Rav didn't say that if someone brought it l'shem oila, it's good. Rav says that even if it was brought stam, it's going to be good for an oila. So whenever an animal cannot be brought for its own purpose, and whenever there is a way of transferring it, of redesigning it, redesignating it, you don't even have to have this uprooting. The kohen doesn't have to be mindful that this is being brought la'oila. The fact that God says it cannot be an asham, it should become an oila, that's called loy boya akira. And guys, that's the whole end of the daf now. So asks the Gemara, Eisvei Rab Chizda to Rav Huna. No one heard it from Rav. Rav Huna was the one that's quoting Rav. Are you telling me that Rav holds loy boya akira can be Tarvas? Go to our Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah itself is not going to be the problem. The problem will be a Braisa that further expounds what our Mishnah says. It says in our Mishnah, the last line of the Amid, that if Shchatoi, right, that case in our Mishnah, the Kohen shechts a Korban Pesach, and after he shechts it, V'noida, he discovers, you know what, all of the owners remove their registration. Again, Rashi writes it's an Einus. We are clearly connecting it to Shitas Rabbi Yeshua. So our Mishnah says what? Pater. Guys, this is the Mishnah. This doesn't refute any din of Rav. Now we got a problem. However, Batani Allah, guys, we're going to always go back to this Braisa, the top line of the Amid. But we learned in a Braisa, our Mishnah is speaking about shechting a Pesach on Shabbos. Now, if a carbon becomes invalidated on Shabbos, forget about the chatos aspect. A carbon that's puzzle has to be burnt. Any psulei hamikdashim was not allowed to be burnt on Shabbos, because generally on Shabbos you can't burn anything. So the Braisa is now focusing not on the chiyuv of the shoichet, the Tani Allah, that if b'choil ki hai gavna, that if you have an animal that was a Pesach, if the 14th is on any day other than on Shabbos, and all of the owners removed their registration, the shoichet didn't know about that, but the animal is invalid. So what do? Ki hai gavna yisaref miyad, you have to burn it right away. Burn it. There was different pyres in the temple area, on the Harabayas, in Yerushalayim, where Psulei HaMikdashim was burned. Now, before we read it inside, this will be the whole base. And that is like this, that Chazal, according to almost all opinions, differentiate between 2 different types of psulim, of disqualifications. Guys, you remember these klal, kachin. Number 1, there is something called an internal disqualification. The animal itself is invalid. Whenever an animal itself becomes invalid, you burn it right away. But there are certain disqualifications that is called external disqualifications. Psul al yedei davar acher. The animal itself is good. Just for example, if the animal was good, the shechita was good, the blood became tamei. That's called a davar acher. So the rule is that even though the animal may not be burned on the altar, but don't forget this animal was kachim. Burning kachim is a certain disrespect. So there are times that the rule is wait for the animal to become overnighted. That's called te'ubar tsu'urasai. Literally means let the form let it become deformed. When an animal is overnighted, it's pasul belina anyway. It's psulina. So now it's less disrespectful to burn it. Now the fact that the Braisa says you burn it right away must mean that there is an internal disqualification. If not, you would have to wait another day. Now here's the problem. Now, not the way you are quoting Rav. Yes, boya akira. Now, what are we talking about? I'll tell you what we're talking about. Every Pesach, if it's not brought l'shem Pesach, what does it become theoretically? What could a Pesach become? A shlamim. By a shlamim, there's no rule of it needing to have pre-registered people. Now, if you have to do akira, there was no akira done over here. So therefore, high Pesachu, it still is a Pesach because it was not uprooted. And the kivin delay ba'alim. So I can put this in the category of psula begufay. And as we just quoted in our small intro, that any disqualification that's called a internal disqualification, taka is burnt right away, yisaref miyad, which explains the beraisa, amtul haki yisaref miyad. But if you Rafuna are right, that what? That the Rav says, who's going to argue with Rav? That the great Rav says, loy bayakira, which means the moment all of the owners withdrew their registration, what happens automatically? If boy akira, this is gavaldik, it becomes a shlamim, upa. So hold on, have a shlamim. So b'chlal, what's the problem? So you shechted a shlamim. I know what the problem is, guys. What did we learn? Oleha hashleim kol hakarbanis. The only problem will be is that you slaughtered the shlamim after the Talmud shel beinu arbaim. That's not called a psula begufay. That's called a psula alidei davar acher. That's called a external disqualification. Sulim mishumayim, mishum davar acher. What's the davar acher? Because alei acher davarmayim. Oy bazoi. How can the Beraisa say yisaref miyad? No, ibur tzura boya. You should wait until tomorrow comes, and then do you burn it? Titanya zaklal kol shem sulim gufa yisaref miyad. But only if it's external. And examples the Beraisa gives is if the dam becomes a puzzle, or if the owner, something is off with the owners, then to ubar tzurase, and only in the morning, the yotza lebeis hasreifa. So l'chu'ura the Beraisa's din is premised that what that boyi akira answers the Gemara. Elam. The first answer is that Rav Huna got it wrong. Rav Huna got it wrong. Rav said the opposite. Eloloi teimai that the Rav says shchatei stam kasher l'shumayla. No, don't forget there were two chidushim. So even if you take away one, there's still a need for the first chiddush. Rav said that if you shechted it l'shumayla, then it's kosher, and that's still a chiddush because the rule is not Rabbi Eliezer kachatas ka'asham. The rule is that this asham should become blemished and it should be sold, and only the money should be used to buy an oila kates hamizbeach. So the Rav is saying that if you already designated it for it to get to go to the pasture, nitkoi l'ne'iyah b'diavad, even if this animal is brought l'oila, it's good, but you have to have in mind l'shem oila. So Rav's din is still needed, but the Rav is not telling you two chidushim; he's telling you only one. Alma punkt fakir that boyi akira. So and now more, and now this Beraisa will be the source for Rav. We're not going to stay with this. Asks the Gemara, Ulerabchia bar Gamda, guys, we just learned this on Daf Samach Dalet. The Amra that needs to come in Peah Chabura. The Amri, right? This is a case where akira, right? Where akira is needed. We're going back to the Koren Pesach. That the case of the Mishnah Daf Samach Gimel was Kagoin Shehoya Ba'olam Tamei Mason. That sometimes if you lost your animal and you brought a new Koren Pesach, this animal has to be a shlamim.
Rabbi.
Let me just finish talking out. But there is a case, and Abchia Bar Gamda explained the Mishnah Samach Gimel. We don't have time to review that case, but you'll have the question over here. That when do we say the case in the Mishnah only where all of the owners of the animal became Tamei Mason? They're a minority. And they would have brought this very animal for Pesach Sheni. Only there is the Mishnah's din that in order for that animal to become a shlamim, you have to have an active uprooting, which is a machshava. According to Rashi and Tosfos, a machshava that's verbalized. Then hayu the boya akira, and that's something that Nisra Kamei Pray. All of the Chevra said that, meaning haba alma loy boya akira. So don't tell me as I given that boya akira ma'ika lameimar. So the Gemara goes back that Rav Huna did not get it wrong. Ella Amar Rav Huna b'rei Rabbi Yeshua, that the Rav Huna by Amar Rav is correct. That the Rav not only taught us that if the animal itself is brought, as long as it was designated to go to the pasture, there's no more gzeira, the animal itself is good. Number two, loy boya akira. So now the question is, why did the Beraisa say yisaref miyad? Yeah, Danny, what's your question?
No, I was wondering, according to the answer where we're saying that Rav requires akira, what happens if you weren't oikerit?
Then the then it's an asham that's brought l'shem olam. So the rule is that the avodah goes on, but it accomplished nothing. It's not a kosher olam. You do, that's the first Mishnah in Zajac. Okay, back over here. So and how will it end for the Braisa? Why does the Braisa say Yisaref miyad? A new nuance. The case was, you had a group of people, they designated an animal the right time before Chatzos, the 14th. And umeisu ba'olam achar Chatzos. Just an example. There was a moment after noon where the animal could have been brought. The owners were alive. The owners were still registered. That's called Chatzos is koiveya. Not that this animal is designated for a Pesach. Now you can bring it. That's called nida. Now it's fit for it to be brought. And then they all passed away. The sheikhah didn't know. Now that's a unique type of disqualification. That's called havale nida. Anytime an animal is first fit and then it's nitcha, then it's rejected. That was another whole sugya of rejection that we had in Kachim. And there's a very important principle. If something was never fit, and the reason for why it was never fit goes away, according to many opinions, it can now become fit. But if something was already fit, and halachically it was rejected, then it can never become fit again. This is not an external factor. This is called an internal factor. That's why over here it's not about akira. That's why, and which must mean, like Rashi points out, that whenever we learned that Moiser Pesach is brought for a shlamim, right? Moiser Pesach, you can bring for it. It must only be referring to a scenario where the animal was lost before midday. That will be the normal case. You lost the animal. So when midday came, there was never a moment where you could have brought it because you had it lost. But whenever the animal was here after noon on the 14th, and there was a moment when you actually could have brought it, whatever happened later never will allow you to bring this animal as a shlamim. Never. That's called nida v'nitcha. Now, guys, don't forget. Remember that whole sugya balachayim nidachim, balachayim ein nidachim. All of that only fits if you allow a living animal to become rejected. So the Gemara says that doesn't work because we know what Rav holds. Midahu taima elol Rav. You're trying to explain Rav. You're trying to explain how the Braisa on top of this Amid doesn't contradict Rav. The problem is, for Amar Rav holds Balei Chaim never are rejected. So we're back to our kasha. If not for Boyi Akira, then the disqualification should be considered Al Yedei Davar Acher, and you should have to wait to Ubar Tzura. So he answers the Gemara. I'll tell you how Rav will answer the Braisa. Rav Papa says that Rav will understand that our Mishnah is following Rabbi Eliezer. In other words, loy boya akira, guys, loy boya akira. So what does it mean? The animal became a shlamim. Now, what happens if a shlamim is brought l'shem Pesach? We quoted this quickly when we learned the Mishnah. Pesach for anything else, chatos for anything else. Everyone holds it's completely possible. What about anything else for a Pesach? Shlamim l'shum Pesach. What's the din? So we kept on saying, it's mitzvah kolduhu. No, Rabbi Eliezer holds, let's read it inside, that just like a Pesach for something else, just like a chatos for something else, is completely invalidated. Any shaloi l'shma Pesach connected, even if the animal is a shlamim. The chein ha-shoichet achedim l'shem Pesach, also puzzle. Which means, according to this Tana, that's called a psul begufay. It's not alidei davar acher. Really, loy boya akira. It became a shlamim. But you shachted it l'shem Pesach. That's a psul aguf. The Gemara says that can't be. Because the whole Braisa is expounding on the Mishnah. The Mishnah began telling you that we had it in the last line of the Amid, that if everyone mashchu ba'olam yedeim, you are putted. Now again, I know that Rashi says you're putted because it's an oinus. The Gemara clearly is also connecting it to only Rabbi Yeshua holding so. According to Rabbi Eliezer, you're going to be chayiv. So the whole Braisa is based on a line of the Mishnah that's not following Rabbi Eliezer. So you can't explain it al pishitas Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbi Eliezer asks the Gemara, chatas nami mechayiv. The whole Leis Lila Rabbi Eliezer Toy B'Dvar Mitzvah Potter. It's here where the Toysus Rabbi Akiva Eger has to work out the Rashi. Good. So Ella, the Gemara goes back again. We're trying to explain how the Braisa doesn't contradict the Rav. Ella, the Gemara Rabbi Yosef the Rab. Guys, this is Chabad Sola, right? Sola Chasidam. Kamed Rav Papa. Oh, that the Braisa is a Das Yochid. The Braisa follows the Tana of Yosef ben Choinoi. And the Tanan, guys, we had this in Zvachim. Yosef ben Chonoi Omer that Haneshchatim l'shem Pesach or l'shem Chatos. He also holds like the Rabbi Eliezer that we quoted is completely possible. So Nachamo loy boya akira. When the Baalim Moshchu Yedeyim, what does it become? Automatically a shlamim. But a shlamim that's brought l'shem Pesach according to Yosef ben Chonoi, who agrees with Rabbi Yeshua by Torah Bar Mitzvah. That's how we took away the question. Is psulim alma psulim bigufahi, and that's why the Mishnah says the Braisa says Yisarif miyad. Now, when we gave that answer before that the Braisa is authored by Rabbi Eliezer, that didn't fit with the flow, but here it fits with the flow. Yosef ben Choinoi only agrees with Rabbi Eliezer concerning shlamim l'shem Pesach, shar zavachim l'shem Pesach. He's machmer. But when it comes to the question of Torah B'Dvar Mitzvah, he holds like Rabbi Yeshua, the second white line, ubipture, to exempt the kohen from a chatos because he was out to do a mitzvah. Here, Yosef ben Chanoi will hold like Rabbi Yeshua. That's a great answer. So this Braisa does not refute Rav. And Rav stands, loy boyi akira. Rav Ashi Omar, another answer, Rav Ashi Omar says that Rav will hold like Rabbi Shmuel ben Yishmael Rechem Bruk. And what sheet is he referring to? The Tanya. Rabbi Shmuel ben Yishmael. Oh, now what is this case? Here we're speaking about a case of a Pesach that was brought on Shabbos. And after we brought it, the Mishnah was, we found out that the owners removed their registration. They got another animal. Here, this Braisa is speaking about another case. That after they shechted the animal, they discovered that all of the people that were registered are old and they're sick and they cannot eat the minimum amount. In other words, they discovered later that it was brought shaloi la'oichlov. So what did Rabbi Yishmael say? Im yeshus v'yoim leida im moshchu b'alim yedeyam oy shemesu oy shenitmu'u. And that's why they're ineligible. It's any case. If he discovered later, if you had enough time to discover, then you're going to be chayiv. So here we have an interesting shita. On one hand, he doesn't hold like Rabbi Eliezer that rejects the whole Torah B'Dvar Mitzvah. Rabbi Eliezer doesn't care. Shoygeg chayiv. Rabbi Yeshua, Torah B'Dvar Mitzvah yapater. Here we're learning another detail, that if you were able to discover there was enough time, so it's close to negligence. We learned this in the Mishnah. There's many levels of shoygeg. You could have discovered, don't give me a Torah B'Dvar chayiv. Now, what happens if you're chayiv? What happens if you're chayiv? Ve'to'ubar tzurasoi. Wow. And this is clearly b'choil, because for Shabbos, you don't need a Tanach to tell you have to wait until Sunday. Nothing was allowed to be burnt on Shabbos if it's not part of the Avodah. Here, this Tanach holds ve'to'ubar tzurasoi v'yoytzel beis hasreifa. Now, hold on. The fact that Rabbi Shmuel holds that if you discover that an animal was not done properly, and we know that it's possible. According to everyone, it's possible. The owners cannot bring it. He's saying that you have to wait until tomorrow. Even if the pshat in the Braisa is based on Boyi Akira, this Tana, Rav found the Tana, obviously holds that Loi Boyi Akira. Because again, Loi Boyi Akira means it becomes automatically a shlamim. If a shlamim is brought l'shem davar acher, that's called a external disqualification because it's only because it was brought after the Talmud shel bein ha'arbaim. And that's Takawai. Rabbi Shmuel holds that the Ubar Tzurasi. Fakir, the Rav will go like this Tana. Says the Gemara to Rav Ashi, no, Rav will not hold like Rabbi Shmuel. Don't use this. Mimai, I can tell you, Dilma, that you know why Rabbi Shmuel says that the Ubar Tzurasi is because Rabbi Shmuel follows Kidatana de Rabba Baravua. The Amar, Afilu Pigol Nami Boye to Ubar Tzura. The Yalef Oven Minoisa. So the whole intro we gave on top of the Amid, which is correct according to almost all of the Tanoim, that we distinguish, we differentiate between what type of psul we have. It's only an internal disqualification that allows you to burn it immediately. But anything that's external, however we're going to define the external, because of the honor we're supposed to give to kachim, you have to wait until it becomes pasul belina to ubar tzurasoi. So there is this one Tana that says that even an internal disqualification has to be overnighted. Noised by default means it was left overnight. And we have this Gezeda Shava. And that's why Rabbi Yishmael says to ubar tzurasoi. Not because loy boya akira. Oh. And and I'll prove it to you that Rabbi Yishmael subscribes to this das yochid over here. Because 3 lines from the bottom, one of the examples the Baraisa gave wasn't that we discovered the owners can eat. One of the examples is that nitmu ba'alim. The owners became tummy. Owners becoming tummy is the example of a external disqualification. The animal was good. The owners are not qualified. That's nitmu ba'alim. And yet, havade boy akira. Here you have to have akira like we learned above. Now, we just learned that any animal, if the owners become tummy, but this animal itself can be brought on Pesach Sheni, because Pesach Sheni, the animal is not beyond a year old, that animal for sure needs akira. And if boya akira, it means this animal is not a shlamim. That should be a internal l'kula alma. A Pesach was shechted and it's puzzle. That's a internal disqualification. So why did Rabbi Yishmael say wait until overnight? Is that I know that Rabbi Yishmael must ascribe to the Tana Devei Rabba Baravua that says that even when you have an internal disqualification, you have to wait until you overnight it. So don't say that the Rav is going to follow Rabbi Yishmael. We're back to say Ela Mechaverta Kedeshane. Like the answer we gave, that is good, that the Baraisa is following Yosef ben Choinai. Yosef ben Choinai holds, like Rabbi Eliezer, that any other animal that's slaughtered l'shem Pesach is automatically invalidated, completely puzzle. Punkt fakert, the Baraisa on top of the Amid holds loy boya akira. When the owners remove the registration, automatically, what does it become? A shlamim. A shlamim that's brought l'shem Pesach, according to this Yosef, like Rabbi Eliezer, it's completely invalidated. That's called a internal invalidation. And on the other hand, Yosef ben Choinai still describes to Shitas Rabbi Yishmael that Tabet var mitzvah pater. So the Shoichet is going to be pater. The Baraisa is expounding the Mishnah. It fits. And Avhuna's version stands, right? And he holds that normally loy boya akira. Now, it's interesting that there's one exception. The one exception is loy boya akira if this animal cannot be brought anymore for its original designation, like the case of an asham. Asham sheneschapru ba'alim. This animal may never be brought. Here is where we say loy boya akira. Why did Rav say you have to designate it for the pasture? Because if not, there's the gzeira. La'acher kapara, koydem kapara. Koydem kapara, la'acher kapara. Gewaldig. But on the other hand, if the animal itself, like the Pesach, that is not being brought because the owners became tamei, if this animal still has a point of redemption, then even Rab will hold boya akira. And Al Piruchni is about us, that we always have redemption. That a Yid is never uprooted, because there's always hope for us. It's only when there's taka no more hope, so it has to be uprooted, then the Torah's uprooting it happens, takes effect. And even if you bring it stam, it's going to be good for Oilah. Hadrin Allah Elu Dvarim. And now, God willing, tomorrow we're going to start the 7th chapter. Just to know, we only have 3 more chapters of this. Let's really squeeze all the juice out of this 7th, 8th, and 9th, because by the 10th, we're coming back to Arvei Pesachim, to a leaving Kachim. And Nishka because Shkolim is still Kachim related, and Yuma is still some nice Yishmaka Kachim, until we get further into Moyed, and then we only hit Kachim at the end when we start with Zvachim. To be continued.
Rabbi.
Go ahead, Rabbi.
Yes.
Rabbi, so quick question.
Yes.
In this whole case of the external versus internal flaw in the animal.
Yes.
If it happened on Shabbos, right? Would they actually, even if it was an internal flaw, which normally you would burn immediately,
wait till the morning
on Shabbos, or
never. That was the whole proof that when Rabbi Yishmael said to Ubar Tzurasai, Rabbi Yishmael must have been speaking about the weekday, because for Shabbos we don't need Rabbi Yishmael to say to Ubar Tzurasai, because no psuli hamikdashim is allowed to be burnt on Shabbos.
Right. Okay.